Well, hello again. Welcome back to Essentials, and a special welcome to Zach. This is his first foray into Essentials. Good to have you here. And boy, we're starting out on a doozy. There's some bizarre readings that we find in Scripture, and we're about to engage one of the most bizarre. Nebuchadnezzar goes crazy. So if you've not read this, get your coffee and enjoy this passage. My initial question to you is, why do we have this account? As we're talking about God's people in exile, is it simply to illustrate that God can just do whatever he wants and he's more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar, kind of a right arm of power, or what is going on?
Sure, yeah, it's certainly bizarre. I think for one thing, we see in this that God is not done with his people, even though he has sent them into exile. This story shows us that God is still very much invested in what's going on in the life and the story of his people. He is sort of there in Babylon with them. We saw that last week when God delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace. And God is still very much invested in his people's story, that we see that again in this passage. And making Nebuchadnezzar insane isn't just a power move on God's part to show that he can put him in his place. It's an illustration actually of what is happening with God's people in exile. Even the word includes us in. It says in one of the verses, you shall be driven out of human society. You'll be driven away. You'll be driven out. And even as God's people have been driven out of their homeland, Nebuchadnezzar has sort of been sent into a kind of exile from his right mind. And the text also says, though, that this is going to take place for a set period of time. After a while, Nebuchadnezzar will go through this, then he'll be restored to sanity and to his royal status. And similarly, even as God prophesied through the prophets over and over again that his people are going to be taken into exile, there's also a prophesied end and a promise of restoration. So what's happening to Nebuchadnezzar is a kind of microcosm of what is happening to God's people in Babylon. They've lost their way. Nebuchadnezzar has lost his mind, but God's going to bring them back.
Yeah, incredible news. So sometimes you feel like you've kind of lost it. God's a redeemer of all of those things. Thank God for me. So at the end of this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar begins praising God and talking about how powerful God is. He says in verse 35, all the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does what he wills with the host of heaven and the inhabitants of earth. So, this kind of sounds like God might be capricious and hope he wakes up on the right side of the bed kind of thing, yeah. Not concerned so much with humanity. As Nebuchadnezzar is kind of going through this process and this transition, what's going on in him? Is he still getting some things wrong?
Yeah, I think so. I think that even though he's been through this experience of going out of his mind and coming back, he still really can't shake the habit of thinking about God in terms of how the Babylonian gods behave. The Babylonian gods, human beings were created sort of as a byproduct, like an accident in the midst of a cosmic battle with the gods, and they don't really matter to the gods other than as servants or really slaves to do their bidding. But what this story shows us is that God is actually very invested in humanity and in human behavior. God does care. And what Nebuchadnezzar does get right at the end of this chapter is when he says, all of God's works are truth, and all his ways are justice, and he is able to bring low those who walk in pride. It sounds like something from the Psalms or even the Song of Mary. It kind of rings familiar in our ears. And you don't have to read very deeply into the book of Daniel or even chapter 4 to see just how prideful of a person Nebuchadnezzar was. And megalomania is a mania. It's a kind of insanity. And so as a form of judgment, God sort of temporarily lifts the veil and allows the true insanity of Nebuchadnezzar's pride to take hold on him. God didn't just make Nebuchadnezzar insane because he's capricious or even just to display his power. Nebuchadnezzar is already insane. God is judging him, yes, but God was also teaching him, just like he's doing with his people in exile.
Yeah, so I'm going to use a different phrase, but self-absorption, you know, and it is a punishment when we're self-absorbed. We heap on ourselves these burning coals of judgment. And what a story of redemption and restoration in the midst of our self-absorption, Nebuchadnezzar and his. God still doesn't abandon not only his people, but even someone like Nebuchadnezzar.
Right, right.
Nobody is outside the mercies of God, who says, even in the midst of your self-absorption, your destruction, your harming my people, I want to bring you into right understanding of who you are and who I am. I think that gives us tremendous hope. So I hope you enjoy your study this week in this bizarre passage of Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll see you again next week.